Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video. For those of you who are going to be leading, facilitating an off-campus small group through Dayspring's ministry, if you're going to be leading one of those adult small groups on the week that goes with the November 17th sermon, using that handout, then you're in the right place. I'm going to be here with you for the next 15 minutes or so, coaching you through your handout for this week. So why don't you go ahead and get that in front of you. It's the Going Deeper sheet for the week of November 18th through 23rd. And I'm going to talk you through the sheet point by point, trying to help make sure that you're ready to facilitate your small group this week. Now, as we get ready to look at this guide together, I don't know if you know the old tale, the Hans Christian Andersen tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. But it's a pretty funny story of an emperor who a couple of swindlers show up offering to make him some new clothes. And these guys, they're just out to swindle the emperor, and they say, we're going to make you some new clothes because we have some magic fabric. And these two swindlers basically say, we have fabric, it's magical, nobody can see it except people like you, king, you, O emperor, and people who are worthy like you, they can see this fabric, but the common folk, they can never see it. So they proceed to make him some new clothes out of this magic fabric, which in actuality is nothing at all. They're just pretending to make clothes for the emperor. Well, of course, when he sees the clothes that they're making for him, which in fact is nothing at all, he doesn't see anything. But he's embarrassed to admit that he can't see anything, because after all, if he says, I can't see these clothes, then he's basically confessing that he's not worthy to even be an emperor. So he pretends to see the clothes, and all of his advisors around him pretend to see the clothes too. So it's kind of a funny tale. Eventually some little boy blurts out, oh, the emperor's naked, he's got no clothes on. But the whole point of the story is that because the emperor and the people around him were so filled with pride, they wouldn't admit that something was wrong. Now, the reality is, you and I are the same way. Oftentimes, we realize that there are certain actions in our lives that aren't healthy, actions that aren't good. We all have a desire for our life. There's a destination that we desire to arrive at. And, it doesn't matter how much we desire to arrive at that destination. What matters is, are we on the right path, and are we doing the things that are going to get us there? Well, sometimes we realize that we're doing things that are going to take us down a different road and bring us to a different destination, but we're so prideful we will not admit it. This small group session that you're going to facilitate is all about that. It's about us just acknowledging, look, there are some actions in my life that aren't in keeping with my desired destination, and I just need to admit that and realize that something needs to change. That's what this whole small group lesson is about. And when you facilitate the small group lesson, you might tell the same little story that I just told. You may just kind of learn what I just said and kick it all off and remind everybody that, we do need to change some of our actions if we're going to change our destination. And that should all make sense in light of the sermon that you're going to hear Sunday from Proverbs chapter 7. So let's look at your handout together. I'm going to walk you through it step by step. There's 9 points. Look at discussion point number 1. It instructs you in your group to read Proverbs 7 and then recap what you heard Sunday using the notes that you took during the sermon. So, of course, as a small group facilitator and leader for this week, you need to take notes yourself so that you can really keep the conversation and dialogue moving during this intro point. Write down any main points, write down any aha thoughts, write down any of the key statements that are made so that you can kind of keep discussion point 1 on track. So you'll recap what you heard. Now look at discussion point number 2. It says, why do you suppose we don't do what we know is good for us? And why do you suppose that we do that which isn't in keeping with the destination at which we want to arrive? I mean, we know where we want to end up, and we know that our actions are going to be the things that get us there. Why is it that when we know here's an action that we need to follow, why is it that we don't do that? And why is it that when we're doing something that takes us down a different path and we know it, why do we keep doing that? You should have some answers to that, kind of in light of the sermon, but this is one of those ones where you're just talking and discussing, and at this point, just let people talk. Just let them discuss, because you're eventually going to answer that question as you move through the handout, all right? Speaking of which, look at discussion point number 3. Here we go. Discussion point number 3, it says, look at Proverbs 6, 16 through 19. You're going to read that together. Now, this is a list of 7 things that the Bible says, 7 things that God is just against, all right? 7 things that he despises, that he hates. Now, I want to teach a little something about some of the ways that the Hebrews would make lists, because that's what you're looking at here. This is a list of 7 things. Now, we like to make lists sometimes. You know, if you watch SportsCenter, they do a top 10 list. If you like David Letterman, he'll do a top 10 list. When you and I make a list like that, there's always a punchline. There's always a zinger. Always something that we want everybody to remember and go away with. In SportsCenter, it's not play number 10, it's play number 1. They're working their way to the top play. David Letterman's list, you know, in theory, it's, you know, 9 all the way down to number 1, and number 1 is the one that's supposed to get the biggest laugh and all of that. Well, the Hebrews were different. When they provided a list, they did have one point of the list that was emphatic, kind of a highlight list. But they didn't go like we do and make the last one the big hit. For them, they tucked it in the middle. So when they would make a list, it would sound a little more like a mountaintop, you know, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So, you know, you would have parallels. The first point would kind of parallel the last point. The second point would parallel the second to last point. The third point would parallel the third to last point. And then the top point, the middle point, that was the emphasis here. Now, when you look at this Proverbs section that you're reading, Proverbs 16 through 19, you'll notice there are 7 points. 7, it's a list. The emphasis here is the 4th point because it's the peak of the mountain, all right? So what you're noticing here, and look at discussion point number 4. This kind of highlights a little bit of what I just told you. And by the way, that whole structure, that Hebrew structure of building to a point, just for what it's worth, they refer to that as chiasm. So that's, you know, chi as in kite, asm as in spasm. That's a form of Hebrew poetry and Hebrew storytelling. You build up to the middle, then you wind back down. And anybody listening in ancient Hebrew culture, that's what they were listening for. Let's listen for the peak. And the peak is the part that we're really supposed to grab hold of and remember. So look at discussion point number 4 here. It says, you'll notice that this is a list of 7 things. And then in Hebrew poetry, the emphatic or the highlighted piece of such a list, it wouldn't be the last thing on the list, but rather it would be that which is found in the middle of the list. So in this list of 7, what is the middle or the 4th thing listed? So I hope you kind of understand this concept that I'm trying to describe to you here. This thing that the Hebrews would have referred to as chiasm. You're building to a point, then you're working back down the point. And 1 in the end is going to parallel, 2 and next to the end is going to parallel, 3 and third from the end is going to parallel, and then 4th, which just kind of stands on its own. That's the part that the writer of the Proverbs is saying, all right, this is the focal point. So you're asking the question now, what is that mountain peak in this list of 7? So just go through it with everybody. You've got 1, okay, so you've got the haughty eyes, you've got the lying tongue, the hands. Okay, number 4, here's where it goes. Number 4, the high point of this list is a heart that plots evil. That should be your answer here when you look at the 7. And notice the parallels, by the way. Number 1, you've got what? You've got haughty eyes. At the end, you've got a person who stirs up conflict. And those may not sound like parallels to you and to me, but they are. Because the Hebrews talked about someone with haughty eyes. That was somebody who was just kind of looking out for themselves, very prideful. Well, the person who stirs up trouble is a person who's looking out for their own interests. So you see the parallel there with 1 and the end. Number 1 and number 7. But look at number 2 and number 6. You've got a lying tongue and somebody who is a false witness, somebody who's telling lies. Do you see the parallel there? Then look at number 3 and number 5. You've got hands and feet. Again, do you see the parallel? Then you come to that middle point, number 4. It doesn't have a parallel. It's a heart that plots evil. So what you're doing now, and you may not fancy yourself a Bible teacher or a Bible scholar, but what you're doing here is you're teaching your group how to read a proverb that's built in this kind of mountain peak sort of a thing. The highlight here is the heart. So look at discussion point number 5. It says the point here is that our heart is the reason that our eyes or our hands or our feet, etc., it's why those things go off course. This proverb really isn't about our eyes or our hands or our feet or our tongue. You know what it's really about? It's about our heart. Because the heart is the spring from which all of those things flow out of. So this is really what the proverb's about. It's about the heart. And look at discussion point 5. And you'll notice, by the way, discussion point number 5, this isn't a discussion point or anything. It's just something you're going to read to everybody. The point here is that our heart is the reason that our eyes, hands, and feet, etc., go off course. Behind any detestable action, there's a heart that leans toward wickedness. All right, so that's kind of the point here of this list of 7 things that we read in Proverbs. The point is that the heart is the problem. All right, so when you find yourself, back to the question that you asked in point number 2, why are my hands doing things I don't want my hands to do? Why are my feet leading me places that I don't want to go? Why is my mouth just saying stuff I don't want to say? Why am I doing things that are not going to lead me to the destination that I want to go to? The answer is the heart. We've got a heart that's chasing after things that are wicked. And the reality is we have a heart that's bent that way. It just gravitates that way. In fact, look at discussion point number 6. It says, read some of these passages about the human heart. And what you're going to see when you read these passages, it's not very flattering about the heart. Some about how the heart is wicked above all things, about how the heart, resists that which is right. The heart really, from its outset, is bent toward that which is wicked and that which is evil. So you'll discover that at discussion point number 6. Now look at discussion point number 7. This is kind of interesting. Based on those passages, what is true of our hearts? So just let people answer it. I mean, the answer should come pretty naturally based on what you read in those passages. And now look at this statement. Do you ever hear or use any general expressions or words of advice about your heart that, in light of what we just read in the Bible, probably aren't good words of wisdom? I mean, seriously, how many times do we tell people, oh, just listen to your heart, or just follow your heart, let your heart be your guide? Well, to be honest with you, based on what we know of our hearts, that's really not good advice. It's really not. Because the heart is, above all things, it's exceedingly wicked. It chases after that which is evil. It's selfish. It's a lot of things that aren't good. So just to follow after our heart, boy, it's actually pretty poor advice, isn't it? Look at discussion point number 8. It says the bad news is that our hearts lean toward wickedness and we're unable to change that. But the good news is that God can change that, and in fact, He does. Then you've got a passage there you're going to read out of Ezekiel, which basically says God takes a heart that's like this, then He changes it into something like this. An old, hard, stony heart, God changes it into a soft heart. He gives us new birth. So really the whole point of discussion point number 8 is this, that God actually changes the very nature of our hearts. That God renews our mind, He transforms us, and now He puts within us a desire for good things. So God changes our heart totally, completely, differently. Look at discussion point number 9. It says, finish by examining this week's memory verse, and then talk about it in very practical terms. Look at the memory verse, if you will. Proverbs 4, verse 23. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for it's the wellspring of life. So here's what you're going to try and get your group to do on this last discussion point. After you look at this verse and kind of notice it, talk in practical terms. How do we now guard our hearts? Because we know, the lust of the eyes and the way of this world and the power of the flesh, it's going to call out to our hearts and try and lead them down paths that are not good. It's going to try and get them to do that which they know that they shouldn't do and even don't want to do. How do we guard against that in very practical terms? So the way that you ought to finish this time here in discussion point number 9, it should be really practical. What are some really practical things that I can do to make sure that my heart doesn't end up walking and leading my hands and feet and tongue down a road that I wish it didn't go? So talk about these practical things. You're going to come back to the basic disciplines of Scripture, of meditating on Scripture, of being in Christian community with people who are doing the same. These are the kind of answers that you're going to come up with because those are the right answers. Those are the things that guard our hearts. So, hopefully in this discussion time, as you facilitate your small group, hopefully you won't be like the emperor who won't admit that there are some actions that really need to be redirected and re-guided. And really what you're trying to get everybody to is this. If you notice that your hands and your feet and your eyes and your tongue, and if you're noticing all these things are going in the wrong direction, it's because your heart is unguarded. Therefore, let's guard that thing. Let's guard our hearts so that we make sure that we head down the path that we want to head down, that we're doing things that are in keeping with the desire of our heart in terms of the destination that we want to arrive at. All right? So I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope that all that stuff about this chiasm in Proverbs 6 made sense to you. You'll notice that we've attached a handout for you about the Proverbs 6 chiasm, something that looks like this. It just describes the structure of this passage that you're working through. If you find it helpful to make copies of that and bring it to group time, I encourage you to do that. But if you do that, don't hand it out until you've already looked at Proverbs 6 and had a chance to work through that discussion point number 4. Don't hand it out until you've gone through that, because otherwise I think it'll kind of get people distracted and off course. But use it if it's helpful. Don't use it if it's not helpful. I think you'll find it helpful, and hopefully it's going to teach you now how to better read things like Proverbs and how to better identify the main point of a passage. But hey, God bless you as you facilitate the small group. Thanks for taking the lead in it. I hope you guys have a great time. God bless you, and we'll see you Sunday.